Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, we're continuing our exploration into the emotional world of narcissism with another clip from my recent conversation with Renee Swanson, certified life coach and the host of the Covert Narcissism podcast. If you caught the last episode, you'll remember we revisited the case of Frank, a public figure whose shame dynamics revealed how complex and painful these patterns can be. For those of you just tuning in, or if you didn't catch that previous episode, a quick reminder. Frank is a fellow who was left waiting for a grocery delivery. It sounds mundane, but it wasn't. He went into a rage and wanted to tear into the woman who had frustrated his need. He had a need for his food to arrive on time, and when it didn't, something deeper unraveled. In this segment, Renee and I explore what happens next. On the surface, Frank tries to smooth things over. He reassures the woman, offers her a drink. But I question Renee, is this really a gesture of empathy and care? What follows is a conversation about the quiet violence of shame, the protective function of rage, and the subtle but crucial work of helping someone like Frank learn to feel guilt without collapsing into self-hatred. As you'll hear, learning to tolerate guilt, to actually feel it without defense, is far more transformative than simply gaining insight into why you behave the way you do. This is where real healing begins. So, without further ado, let me bring you right into my conversation with Renee. I hope you find it both moving and relatable.
Coming back to the question that Frank is asking, does this knowledge help us? Okay, we can start to dissect. Is it guilt? Is it shame? Is it empathy? Is it image repair? Does the knowledge of all of this, how does that help us in a therapeutic sense?
Mm-hmm. This is so commonly confused. Like if you listen to social media, I've mentioned this so many times in my own podcast, is there are many very insightful people on social media who could come up with wonderful interpretations, like the example with Dr. R, who linked it up, shame and helplessness. But in my opinion, unless that comes at the right time, that kind of stuff does not help. No. Now, I'm a psychodynamic therapist, so it might be surprising to hear me say insight, is not always that important. But what I'm really, just to make it very clear, insight is helpful. That knowledge does help, Renee, when it comes at the right time. And this moment, this timing is off. And we hear it by Frank's question. And that's how we know. That's our clue. Anytime a patient asks, or like someone says, after you put some brilliant intervention in place or interpretation or reflection, and they say something like, but how's that supposed to help me? Or what do I do with that now? You can know, you can rest assured that your timing was off. So what has to happen instead is you have to help someone develop a capacity for guilt, right? That's the first step, because if they're slipping back or regressing or collapsing into a shame mode, further work needs to be done before they can even hear a comment like that without feeling ashamed. You see, again, I don't want to digress too far, but I just had this other thought. That kind of comment can actually make someone who's narcissistically vulnerable feel more ashamed, not less ashamed. Why? Because now you're the expert. You know everything. And it puts them in a one-down position. You're the authority telling them about their inner life, rather than two people together exploring what were all the thoughts and fantasies, like I just demonstrated a little while ago that I would ask Frank.
Yeah. If the approach to seeking this knowledge, seeking this insight from somebody like Frank, if the approach is, again, more self-judgment, it's not going to help. So I think what I'm hearing on the timing is, are they at a point where they're receptive to it and able to actually hear what's being said without judgment, without that self-judgment? I talk about that a lot, of being able to give yourself grace. And if you're not to the point you can give yourself grace, at least being able to give yourself space.
Space. Okay? That's it right there. There's no space. Anyone who's struggling with these characteristics and is shame, we both said, we don't know exactly what he's experiencing, but the signs indicate that this was shame and not guilt, then we know already there's no space because they're just attacking themselves. Remember, it's not about the other person. It's not about a relationship anymore. So what makes you think you're the expert and you could come in? See, you're assuming there's a relationship and they're going to hear you and your brilliant insight, but that assumes there's space, and there's not space with these individuals. We have to help them develop the capacity to have space, to separate in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Without that space, I'm going to go back to the guilt and shame question. Without that space for other people, like space for another person to exist safely in their world, then without that, I think that also feeds more of that shame spiral, because shame is very, very internally driven, like internally focused. I'm going to put it that way. It's that I've done wrong. I'm bad. I'm a horrible person. And there's no space for that other person and their feelings. Even though I may have hurt them, it's not about them. And so repair still isn't about them. Repair is still about me.
That's right. And just to add one more piece to drive it home, if that other person gives knowledge, again, it's not about the other person. It's not like, thank you so much. I appreciate that different perspective, Dr. R. No way. That's not, and maybe listen, that's the worst case scenario, just so you know, is they nod and they say, oh, that's so, so helpful. Thank you so much. And Frank was very polite. He kind of went along with Dr. R, but then he asked that brilliant question. Like, how is this supposed to help? Or is this supposed to help people? Like, he knew it. Like, he's a smart guy, but he's a nice guy at that moment. He's not confronting, and like I said, that's the worst case scenarios, because then you get a patient or a person in your life who's just compliant and they're going along with what you said until 6 months down the road, nothing is changing. And then you have two frustrated people in the room.
Yeah. Because it doesn't push towards restoration.
Yeah. Because for restoration, you need, there has to be, again, I don't want to get too theoretical, but let's just say healthy guilt we established is a developmental achievement, because it implies that there's another person separate from me. There's your space, who has their own thoughts and feelings. And Frank eventually seemed to get to that when he said, oh, this woman walked in and I saw she was sweating and the eggs were broken. And he felt some level of compassion for her.
So in this situation where, you have, maybe even it started as guilt and then it went into shame, but if you've got individuals that are experiencing this, is there a way to help people to be able to, like, emotionally, I don't know if you want to call it emotional maturity, emotional growth, but be able to grow to the point that they can experience guilt without that internal collapse?
This is such an important question. And that's why I think this vignette is so valuable, because it captures so much of what people experience in these questions you're raising. So again, for people who are organized around, let's just say, narcissistic defenses, guilt is often intolerable. Like, they have a hard time tolerating guilt. Why? Because it threatens to expose vulnerabilities. Back to what you mentioned earlier, Renee, like with people who are narcissistically vulnerable, they do not have, and we call it vulnerable, but they are not vulnerable. You see, that's the whole point, is to protect their vulnerabilities. So what would somebody like this in this situation be protecting? I care about your feelings, because that's guilt. Remember, there's the empathy. I care about your feelings, and that has to be protected. Why? Why is caring such a problem? Because caring then implies that, again, there's that space that you just mentioned, which means there are now two people in a relationship, unlike a narcissistic relationship where there's just one person. It's all about me. Remember that? So now there are two people, and if there are two people, there's a chance of what? Disappointment, uncertainty, and the
Conflict.
Conflict, needing someone, coming to depend on somebody. And even healthy dependency is a risk, right? Because they see dependency as so needy and pathetic. There's your shame again. It's shameful to depend on anybody. So guilt implies separateness. Guilt implies caring and empathy. And caring and empathy is a threat to somebody, because then they could be vulnerable to being hurt again. And many of these people were hurt very badly in their childhood. And that's why they formed this adaptive system where they don't care as deeply about other people, because that helps protect them from feeling vulnerable. So to depend means to feel humiliated and exposed. So there again is your need. Your shame. And Frank, in this example, actually had a need. And we won't even go into all the oral, the dependency longings. Remember, it was about food, by the way, which suggests if we played around with it symbolically, that has deep meaning to him, being left waiting. But he actually had a need. And when anybody expresses a need, there's a possibility that it will go unmet. So that's why so many people with narcissism put up this grandiose structure, because in that grandiose structure, they're dismissive. I don't need anybody. I'm self-sufficient. But here, see, Frank was exposed. So these are some of the reasons it's dangerous. So guilt slides back into shame when there's this feeling of like, I cannot care about somebody else. And then on top of that, to admit, this is another problem, right? That if he says, I hurt you to the delivery woman, like he admits that, or anybody with narcissistic vulnerabilities admits that they hurt somebody, which is more like guilt, remember, because then you're going to repair it. That's a big problem too, because now if you hurt somebody, Renee, you are flawed. You're bad. You're not perfect. So now your idealized image of yourself begins to collapse, because, your image of yourself is one of what? Flawlessness. So there's another reason, like guilt is very hard for someone with with these characteristics to experience. So we have to help them develop a capacity for guilt. So that would be the next step in this. So we could say, I don't know if I answered the question. If not, please, let's go over it again. But that guilt is very hard to experience for the reasons I just delineated. And then the goal is to help them develop a capacity to tolerate guilt.
Yeah. Yeah. You touched on perfection or talked about being perfect.
Yeah.
And I do think that ties in really closely here. That when we have this image, image of perfection, then I can't experience guilt, because guilt would mean I've done something wrong, which would buck up against my image, my self-image, that I'm perfect. Yep. And so instead of being able to experience guilt, I can only experience shame, because the shame says I'm not perfect. And if I'm not perfect, then I'm a failure. I'm a total failure.
Yeah.
And it's that extreme, then there's no in between. It's like that black and white thinking. I'm either all good or all bad.
That's right.
And because people are a mixture of this, but somebody who's narcissistically inclined, they can't handle that mixture. I'm either all good or all bad, and you're either all good or all bad.
Yes.
And so I think that's part of where this image of perfection, I think, is, even though they might say, well, I know I'm not perfect, it's still a battle that's going on inside of them.
Let's take a quick break.
I get a lot of messages from listeners saying, Dr. Mazzella, I wish I could talk to you directly, but I also know that private therapy or one-on-one sessions aren't always possible or affordable. That's why I'm thinking about creating office hours, a low-cost, small group space where you can bring your questions about the podcast content, your confusion about narcissistic relationships, traits, and dynamics, and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's room for real conversation too. This space is designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If this speaks to you, head to drmazzella.com/office hours, or just click on the link in the show notes to get notified when it launches. Okay, hope to see you there. Yeah, it's like an intellectual understanding. They could say that, but their life does not validate that. Like they don't exemplify that.
They're saying it because they know they're supposed to.
Exactly.
Because it's, we got to be humble. So I'm going to make sure I'm being humble, and I'm going to be perfect in being humble.
Yeah. So now one thing that as I was listening to you that I may have confused a bit. So let me take one more sort of pass at this. So what you said is like, they don't want to feel vulnerable, but when they enter the shame state to get away from guilt, like guilt collapses into shame, they seem to be very vulnerable, right? Like what a pathetic loser I am. I screwed up. All of that stuff. But we have to remember now, when they enter into this shame state, I don't like this word. It seems pejorative, but the primitive defenses now are activated. And that just means what you were saying. These are just early level defenses that distort reality more. And one of them is splitting. And that's the one you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. So once they enter into that stage, that pathetic stage, where they're ashamed, we have to remember it's only so long they stay there, because that gets split off and projected. And that's the other reason it presents such a problem in their life. Because now it's like, look at this delivery woman. What's wrong with her? Oh, look what you've done to me. Or you should be ashamed of the way you behaved. You kept me waiting. What's wrong? You can't even run on time at your own job. You see, so that's how they eject or we say it's split off and project the shameful state, and that can make them feel a little bit better. So that's how they get a reprieve from it. But it never works out. I mean, obviously, they still stay stuck. Yeah.
Right. And at the end of the day, it's still all about self-preservation.
Yeah. And not connection and repair and all the things that are necessary for a developmental achievement to take place so that they could begin to repair their damaged sense of self-worth and self-esteem.
Right.
So how do we help somebody get there, Renee?
That's a good question. And that's what I was just thinking. You know, you touched on something a little while ago that I'd love to explore a little bit in the time we have left. And that is, we're talking about guilt and shame. We're trying to distinguish between the two. If those two are getting confused, or if it's I'm going to say diagnosed in a therapeutic situation, mislabeled, okay, as opposed to diagnosed, mislabeled.
Yes.
That the challenges that mislabel creates is maybe you're treating the wrong thing.
Yep.
That treating guilt and treating shame, I would imagine, is going to look different.
Yes.
Can
Very
you speak
different.
to that for a minute?
Yeah. So let's go back to Frank, just so again, it's very grounded in this example instead of theoretical. So Frank says, how did I get lucky in that moment? If I could reproduce that, I wouldn't be the piece of shit person that I am. Just a reminder, that he wanted to reproduce was what? Empathy that he felt for the delivery woman. He's saying, if I could just reproduce that, but he knows he can't, right? So this reveals how, for some reason, guilt quickly fuses with annihilating shame. At that moment, I might gently point out, and this is how I would work with it, Renee, to help someone begin to tolerate or experience guilt. I would say, you're calling yourself a piece of shit. But what if at that moment wasn't about luck? Remember, he said it could be luck. Rather than coming from him, it's like luck. But about something in you that could truly feel her humanity. What does it feel like to let that in without attacking yourself? You see, so like every narcissistically disturbed patient that I've ever met, I'm not saying this is all of them. If you pay close enough attention like this, like I'm demonstrating, and again, I do this all the time on my podcast because it drives me crazy when people say that these people never ever change and they have no capacity for guilt or empathy. Here it is, but it's so subtle and it disappears so quickly because of what you and I were just talking about, is to feel that means the whole separate, I won't go into it all again, but there are many dangers that come along with experiencing guilt. Mm-hmm. So little by little, I want to start pulling this to the fore and ask him, what would that feel like without attacking yourself? In other words, why can he not allow himself to sit with what might be a more genuine, vulnerable feeling, you see? So that was, I think, a genuine moment that he had. And that was the part that probably Dr. R picked up on, right? When he said, oh, you just felt guilty, but he skipped everything else that we covered so far. But the point is to build the capacity to stay with that feeling, one that for some unknown reason, we don't even know why until, again, we explore it, like I mentioned before, with the reparative effort. We don't know if it was reparative. We don't know if this was guilt until we stay with it and we look at why it had to quickly be pushed away and chalked up to like luck or I'm just a piece of shit. That's the essential part of the work that helps them transition or stop collapsing from guilt into shame. Yeah.
Sure. And if a narcissistically inclined person goes to get help, they want to go change. They see it maybe briefly in themselves and they want to go get help. But if they go in only trying to repair the external issues, I need to stop talking to my partner this way. I need to make sure I talk in a regular voice and not raise my voice. I need to not throw things in the kitchen. And they're correcting their outward expression of behavior. I could see maybe some of the confusion lying in they are getting treated for guilt, or they are facing, okay, I'm guilty because I did these things, therefore I need to quit doing these things. Yes. But people tell me often, my partner has agreed to go get help and they're going to therapy, they're going to counseling, and some of the behaviors have improved, but the problems are still there. The core is still there.
Do you know what that means? Like the problems have improved, meaning that they lash out a little bit less? Is that what they mean?
Yes.
But the core issue might be something more like what? Do you know, or can you flush it out?
So I would say that the core issues not being addressed are the underlying shame, self-talk, the negative self-talk, the self-sabotaging behaviors. All of that is still there. So while the outward expression might get better because it's like learning a checklist of the behaviors I'm supposed to do. Yes. Okay. But it doesn't repair. The
Right.
repair is missing. That it's a big gaping hole. Going back to him offering the lady a drink,
Yes.
is that repair or was that self-protection still? So then the confusion comes of, okay, are they trying to repair? They came home, they're not yelling anymore, they're not throwing things anymore, they're being attentive to going to events that I like to go to, they're letting me go have lunch with my friends, these kind of things.
Yeah.
But the relationship's not better. That
Yeah.
there's
Oh, Renee, this is so fascinating. So let me just associate to it, okay? So one thing that I always want to know, like when a patient starts with me and we have a consultation period, I meet with them a few times so I can make a recommendation in terms of what's going to be best based on what they want to achieve. So if they just want to achieve a little bit more harmony in the home, then this is successful, by the way. There's some improvement here. They're not lashing out. They could tolerate their frustration a little bit more. So things on the surface get better. And that may be all that somebody wants. So in that way, great. That could be a place where we can celebrate, some sort of accomplishment that was made in terms of regulating impulse control, not becoming as dysregulated, et cetera, et cetera. But now, Renee, what you're pointing out is something a little bit more complicated, because in order to really repair, then one would make an argument that, sure, of course there are still problems, because what you have now on your hands is somebody who's more compliant, right?
Mhm.
That's what you have, is someone who's doing their best to behave in a certain way because Dr. R told them to, or their wife told them to. But typically what I've seen, because I've been doing this for many years, is patients do get to the point where they're like, this is good enough, and then they leave and they feel good. But then 6 months later or a year later, they call me back and they come back because they say for some reason it didn't hold. And what I say is it was not yet well integrated. In other words, it didn't become part of their personality. It was like a behavioral change. So of course it doesn't hold, and because it was nothing really, to your point, like that deeper, genuine work didn't go on. And it's interesting I use the word integration, because that's what really heals this for the long run, is integrating that more vulnerable side of Frank that I mentioned that he had to push away, that he did have a genuine moment, but you saw it quickly change to it was luck or self-hatred, like because he probably felt too vulnerable. But that's the stuff we want to integrate, because we know that people with personality disorders have the fragmented sense of self. So we want to help them become more integrated. And that's the longer work, unfortunately. That's the 6 months plus work to help them integrate this and finally get comfortable with being a little more vulnerable like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the work that a lot of the people that I've worked with that are expressing, they've been going to therapy, they're trying to get help, but it's not changing. Nothing's ever changing. Or
Yeah.
they changed for 6 months, but then all the behaviors came back, and the things that you're expressing here.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're voicing here is the work that's missing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it would be wonderful, I have to be honest, if like the insight that Dr. R gave to Frank about that process of shame and rage and then lack of empathy or helplessness, if just knowing that intellectually, back to your initial question, was curative or healing, that would be like amazing, wouldn't it? Because then anybody could pick up a textbook and just read this stuff and they would feel so much better. Yeah.
That's a
So
good point. Yeah, that's
yeah.
a good point.
So
That
that's
if it were just that easy, and I don't want to say easy, but if it were that simple, maybe is a better
Yeah.
word for it. If it was just that simple, then there would be some benefit to that. But it isn't. This is hard work. It's deep work. It's very reflective and it's very vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, it's much harder to sit there and say, wait, let's slow down. You're right. Let's go back. And I did say that for a moment. I did recognize her humanity. I did offer her a drink, and I really do want to do that more often. Yeah, what does prevent me from doing that? Or, hey, yes, I did notice now that you mentioned it. One moment I was attacking myself, calling myself a piece of shit, right? Pacing back and forth, anxiously waiting to attack this. I was attacking myself, and then I was attacking her, right? Waiting to attack her. I couldn't wait for her to arrive so I could tear into her. Looking at that stuff it takes a little bit longer and it's a little more complicated, because now we could see he's oscillating between two very different positions, right? So he goes from blaming himself to blaming her, and then probably back to blaming himself again. And it's like a ping pong game that drives people crazy. But all of that is about, again, that's part of integrating so that it's not that split world that you mentioned earlier, where someone is always to blame and should be persecuted. Either I'm being persecuted with the critical voice, or I'm going to persecute you and tear into you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All in the name of protective mode. Yeah.
All in the name of protecting. Yes, that's right.
Yes.
A vulnerability, because again, we speculated, we don't know what, but that he was left waiting, that he began to feel like nobody could see him, that nobody cared about him. And this brings up early narcissistic issues with a caregiver who most likely wasn't there for Frank earlier in his life, at least not in a way that he needed them to be.
Yeah. The familiar feelings, familiar thoughts that trigger unhealed wounds.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the kind of stuff you have to get into, right, Renee? So this way, to answer the question, so guilt does not collapse into shame, and that so development can proceed with reparative efforts, and that makes for more loving relationships, which makes one feel less persecuted, because the more love or care or concern that comes in, typically the less persecuted one feels or attacked. Yeah.
You find
That's
safety.
the healing. That's it. Yes, your word, safety. I like that.
Yeah. But Dr. Mazzella, thank you so much for this deep dive into guilt and shame. I can absolutely see the value of this for everybody involved in these relationships, for the narcissistically inclined people, but also for those who are dealing with all of this on their end, which, then we put our own protective measures up. So we're all, in essence, dealing with this. And so I do think it's a very valuable way to look at all of this. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your thoughtfulness and your thoughtful questions and your responses. I think this conversation was definitely layered. So I really appreciate that you carved out the time for us to really get into this in a more complicated way. So thank you again, Renee. And I look forward to more of these in the future. So that was part 2 of my conversation with Renee. As you heard, insight alone doesn't transform us. What matters is whether we stay with the feeling. For someone like Frank, learning to tolerate guilt without collapsing into shame is the real work, not fixing the behavior within an apology or an explanation, but sitting in the discomfort, whether it's the pain of having hurt someone, either real or imagined, in other words, this could be in your head, without turning it into self-condemnation, or the discomfort of more compassionate feelings. Again, something that I was demonstrating in the case of Frank. And those compassionate feelings challenge the harsh, rigid self-image. Okay, as always, thank you for listening. And if this resonated with you, please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.